Welcome to part 2 in this series of lessons showing you how to draw 3 different cityscapes in pen and ink. Now just a heads up, these are fairly in-depth ink drawings rather than the quick sketches that you see in urban sketching, and I do like doing those, but sometimes you just want to put a little bit more detail into your artwork. For this second project, we're going to be drawing the iconic Brooklyn Bridge in New York. Absolutely perfect subject matter, I think, for pen and ink. If you missed part 1, we drew a street scene for London, and in part 3, we're going to be doing another busy street scene, and you'll find the links to all of those parts in the description. Check that description as well for materials and links to download the reference photographs to follow along, because I do want you to follow along. If you do enjoy this lesson, a quick thumbs up is always much appreciated, or drop me a comment in the section below. Other than that, once you've done this second cityscape, please do come and find me for cityscape number 3. Okay, so you can see that I've already spent quite a bit of time on the initial outline drawing. In fact, this took me about 45 minutes, maybe even a little bit longer, 60 minutes, and I suspect that that's going to be about the same amount of time that the rest of the drawing in ink takes me. And the reason for that is that it is an intricate subject matter, and the perspective is really, really important to get nailed on. So even if you're going to end up with quite a sketchy, quite a loose rendition, if your perspective is sloppy, if you don't take care over the vanishing points and taking your lines to those vanishing points, the image isn't going to work. So you can see that I've left in these construction lines here. So these are going to my vanishing points. And if you think back to the Drawing Essentials course, or any of you that are already familiar with perspective, you'll see that this is 2-point perspective. So if I bring my ruler in, you can see that the lines on this side of the image, so the left-hand side, all of the horizontal lines are going down to a point somewhere right in the middle of the skyline at the back. So if I take the ruler around, you can see that is our vanishing point. The vanishing point on the right-hand side of the image for these lines here and these lines down here is way off the paper. Okay, so you can't see that on camera. I don't actually have a vanishing point for that because it's so far off the paper, I'd have to put 2 or 3 pieces of paper down just to fit that on. But by putting them in, what it allows me to do is, if I've got to gauge some lines in between these two, I'm going to know roughly what angle to put those lines at. Similarly up here, I know that that angle of that line is gradually going to increase. Now the way that I approached this drawing was to first put in a vertical line that split the left and right hand vanishing points up. So I drew in a line right down the middle, and it is right between this section of the bridge. I then put in this strong diagonal line, so I just measured it with a pen or with a pencil, and we've got that strong diagonal line in, put that one in, and then you can build the image from there. So by looking at the top angle and putting that one in, I can then draw down with a ruler, and well, you can't find the point with the first line, but you can draw that first construction line in, measure the angle at the very bottom, so it's this one here, put that one in, take your line up with your ruler, and then you can plot in your vanishing point. Everything else then becomes that much easier because you can take a line from your vanishing point to make sure that all of these little details on the bridge are the correct angle. Your next challenge is to separate these lines so that they are the correct distance. So for example, this line here is slightly less than halfway, isn't it? So it's a bit closer to the bottom edge than it is to the top edge. If you're drawing your picture exactly the same size as your reference photograph, that's quite easy. There is a little cheat or hack, if you like. You can place your reference photograph, as I have, right next to your drawing, and then just move across and make a little mark there. Same for any other reference point that you want to put in. Now, other than that, the only other piece of advice that you need for a drawing like this is to take your time. The more time that you spend on this initial drawing stage, the better I think your overall ink drawing is going to be. So for example, this area here, so the distance between this and this column here and this column, has actually got, if you can count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in. And it's quite easy to get a little bit bogged down with those lines and make one too far apart and then the next one too close together and then the next one you've not got enough room to put in. So the way that, again, I approach this is to look at the total distance and get that in first. So you put the total width in first, then break it up with the middle line, which would be this one. So if I just draw this to the side so you can see what I mean, we can erase it later. So I'd look at the total width, and then I'd look at the middle line that separates them. Is that right in the middle? Well, for this it roughly was. So this line here is in the middle of these two. And then I'd separate and put these two in. So this one was in the middle here. This one, however, was slightly closer. And that is much easier. You're going to get a much better result than if you try to put one line in, then the next one, and then you think, well, the next one's there and the next one's there. What you end up with is the overall width being too wide or too narrow, and things start to get out of proportion. The first thing I'm going to do is just to erase back some of these lines with a kneadable eraser, just so they're a little less imposing. I just find them a little bit too imposing when they're that strong when I'm going over with the ink. There we go. So you might not be able to see those lines on camera. I can still see them, and I've got the confidence of having drawn the lines in initially that I can replicate those with the pen. So I'm going to use a 0.3mm pen. That's middle of the range, 0.1 being our smallest, 0.5 being the largest. And I'm just going to go over the outline. But what I am going to avoid doing is drawing solid, strong black lines. I'll talk more about this as I go through. And for large parts of this, we're going to speed the process up because it is just a case of going over the lines that you've already made. But there are a few points that I do want to pick out. So when I come to those, we'll slow things down and you can see them. Up to you where you start. Always a good idea, I think, to start more in the foreground and with some of the strongest lines. So we've got this strong angle here. We put these in. So you can see I'm using the pen slightly on the side. I'm not straight down. I want to get quite a thin, on occasion, hit and miss line. I don't want strong black lines, not at this stage. So again, you can see the hit and miss lines when necessary. Always err on the side of being more conservative, lines that are more hit and miss. At any stage, I'll just say this one more time, but at any stage that you're not sure at the angle of your line, just take a step back and follow the construction lines that you can see to your vanishing point. It's really, really important. You don't want to ruin a drawing that you're going to put a fair amount of time into with a couple of dodgy perspective lines. So for this line, I just want the faintest of marks. So I'm just touching the paper, hardly putting anything in. And the reason is because this is in the light, this is a light side of the building, of the structure. And if I was to place a dark line in that, it's going to look artificially outlined, which is not the effect that we're looking for. And don't worry as well, you'll see that a lot of my lines look quite shaky. So yes, we want these verticals to be nice and vertical, so parallel to the edge of your drawing plane, your paper in this case. We want them to be nice and vertical, but we don't want them to be ruler straight. We don't need them to be ruler straight because this is a drawing and we want to show some character within the marks that we make. Okay, while we're in this area, just a quick tip, just something that has reminded me when you're in the drawing stage. If you have a construction line in pencil that runs across the top of the image, what it will do is it will make sure that each of these individual pillars are nicely in line with each other. They're the right height comparative to each other. If you don't have this line here and you just try and draw them individually by eye, what tends to happen is you get one that's slightly higher and then one that's a bit lower, one that's somewhere in between, and it just spoils the effect. That construction line across the top of them works really well. Okay, now as I get into this more distant area here, this part of the bridge, the skyline in the back, I'm going to a 0.1mm pen. So this is the smallest pen that I own, the smallest pen that we're going to be using for this particular study. And the reason for that is that you want thinner, finer marks into the distance. Because we want them to be less imposing, less dominant, they should be thinner, finer marks. Okay, real hit and miss in the background here. So you'll notice that at no point in any part of the drawing have I used these solid black lines. They're all a little bit shaky, a little bit hit and miss, but that's certainly the case as you get into the background. The nib of the pen we're using on a flat angle, a flat air angle. You know, go too flat at first, all that will happen is that you won't get any ink out. So there's no ink coming out, but you can just gradually adjust that until the ink starts to flow. And then the same for the skyline in the back. So this now becomes real hit and miss. So touching the pen and then lifting off. And by the way, when I drew this, this skyline in, all I was doing was just drawing basic shapes. So basic blocks, cubes, squares, that kind of thing. And what I did do was just measure the angle just with the pen. You don't have to get these exact, so you don't have to worry about taking every horizontal through to a vanishing point. But it's very easy to be confused, for your eye to be confused as to whether the top line of this, for example, is it sloping up or sloping down. And it's not until you place your pen or an object on there that it becomes obvious. So just place your pen as you get to each building, just so that you're putting in lines that are not going to be too far out. So there's our line drawing, and at this stage you should be really happy with your construction lines and your perspective lines. Now, even though we've put this down in ink, there is still a bit of an opportunity with the shading process to make some adjustments if necessary. And I think it's well worth going over with your ruler just to make sure that your horizontal lines all go to the correct vanishing point, left and right, and that your verticals are indeed vertical. Okay, so for the shading, I'm going to start with a 0.3 pen. You can start where you like. My recommendation is to focus on something in the foreground and your biggest focal point, which is this part. So I'm going to start with these vertical columns, and I'm going to keep the mark making fairly vertical. I'm not going to put a lot of cross hatching in. I'm just going to keep these nice and vertical. And don't worry if you get what appears to be tide marks. This is going to end up being a lot darker than this, so we can go over the places that we need to just to remove those if it's something that offends your eye. So shadow side there, this is a shadow side, so let's put that in. When you've got all these different lines that are close together, it's always a good idea to get the shadow planes in first, because that way it just gives you some extra information. It's another piece of the puzzle that makes everything that much clearer, so that you can carry on with a bit more confidence. So on this particular plane here, the light is catching this area, so that's a nice little detail to keep in. So I'll make sure that we reserve that. And another point just to note, if you're not too familiar with drawing with ink, so the hatching process, you'll notice that all of my marks are in one direction. So I'm making a mark down, lifting the pen, mark down. What I'm not doing is backwards and forwards as you might do with a graphite pencil. That's going to start to look quite messy, and is not really a style, I don't think, that is in keeping with pen and ink. Okay, and then as I come onto these planes here, so these pieces here in between the pillars, you'll notice that the value or the tone of each of these is pretty similar. So it's quite difficult with ink anyway to show that one is forward and one is recessed. It is going to help when we put the darker areas of shadow in between them. But what I want to try and do is just distinguish between two different planes, one that's further forward, one that's further recessed. So for these planes, I'm going to do some cross hatching. So vertical marks to begin with. And again, notice how these lines are of a hit and miss quality. So I'm using light pressure. The pen is on an angle such that I don't get these jet black solid lines. I get scratchy marks, hit and miss here and there. And that just gives me more opportunity later on to add a greater level of texture and mark making and subtlety, compared to if these were really thick, dark, jet black lines, something that you would get with a felt tip pen. Okay, and then I'm going to place some cross hatching marks across these areas just so we can separate the mark making on this plane from this plane. Now the important thing is that you don't just go and put horizontal cross hatching marks in. You want to keep these cross hatches relative to the perspective lines that you've put in already, and that's where these construction lines come in. So I've got one that I can just about see here in pencil. You might not be able to see this, but there's one there, one here and here. And I can now not have to take every line obviously through to the vanishing point, but I'm going to be able to get a feel for the angle that I need to move the pen on as I make these hatching marks and how that angle is going to change. So we'll start at the bottom. Again, same kind of hit and miss scratchy line. And I'm just adjusting the angle as I move up. So from the bottom, I know that it's the angle here. As I move up, that angle is going to change. Okay, same on here, so we can start from the top. This is a bit difficult for me to do without being able to turn the paper around. You can certainly should turn the paper around so you're not forcing yourself to work at funny angles. Okay, and then at this point, I think it's nice to start putting in some of the stronger shadows. Some of the strong shadow lines that you get under the lips of the stonework, up here at the top. Some of the stronger shadows maybe in this side here, in here, some in and around here, certainly underneath the bridge. That's just going to help you to establish that tonal range that you're going to get throughout your drawing. So let's start from the top and work our way down. Keeping with the hatching mark, so we're not just going in and colouring things in. I do want to look for any of these overhanging lips on the stonework that I can put in as a nice strong shadow line. So none on there, but we can certainly get a few in here. This area needs to be quite dark in here. There's a dark lip under there. Got this dark piece down the bottom. That piece is in the light. This is really dark down here, so we can put this in as a nice strong dark. Okay, so this area down here is really dark, isn't it? So we can just strengthen the marks that we've already put in, the hatching and the cross hatching. And then we've got this side here, which is really dark. Got a really dark area up the top here. So there's the lip at the top of the building, top of the structure, which is in shadow. It's casting a shadow. So let's get that one in. Strengthen this dark plane here. So that's in quite a lot of heavy shadow. Got a really strong dark in here. So this is completely black, this shape. So just observe what shape it is. So in this area here now, we've got some real nice dark shadows, but also some weathering within the stonework itself. So what I'm going to do is, starting at the top and just distinguishing this pillar from this plane here, I'm going to outline that side edge there, and then from the top, just dragging down. So lifting off as you get further down. You can actually put this edge in here as a nice strong dark, just so we give ourselves somewhere to work from. So from the top, dragging down. And what hopefully that is going to represent is a sense of weathering, you know, rust and dirt and grime that is leaked through from the bridge above onto the stonework below. So this is a really dark area under here, so we can add quite a bit on there. But always starting from the top, working down, and that way you'll get the strongest values towards the top, and they'll gradually fade off as you lift the pen off below. And then the same from the bottom, so you want to work up this time from the bottom and lift off. Add a bit of hatching in if you want to, just towards the bottom. Just to remind the viewer that this is a different plane. And then the same again on this side, so that we can then establish this outer edge of this pillar here. So rather than just drawing a line down to outline it that way, that's the lazy way, we're going to pull down some value from the top. Let's get that line in again, just so we know where we're working from. So from the top and down, and again from the bottom, so we can work up. Now at this stage, it's a good opportunity just to step back and make an assessment of the values that you've added down. So are there any areas that you want to strengthen that are too light in comparison to the rest of the marks that you've put down already? And I would say these areas here are a little bit too light. So I'm going to strengthen these. I'm going to go over with the 0.1 pen, so 0.1 mil. Same directional marks, just going over them to strengthen them. And then what we can do in the same way that we did round here is, even if it's not in the reference photo, just give a sense of a bit of weathering. Just helps to separate this plane from the pillar next to it. So just on the left hand side there, maybe strengthen this line slightly. It's really dark in this corner, isn't it? So let's just add some extra hatching just to, so everything gets lost in the corners, which tends to happen anyway. You'll see that a lot with architecture as you're drawing it. Just giving a slight indication that there's some stonework just around these two arches, because they're obviously very characteristic of this bridge. So you can afford to add a little bit more detail around them. But I'm not trying to draw in individual bricks. I'm literally just putting in a few extra marks just around that area. And then for inside the archways, we've got a shadow that comes across in that direction, same on here as well. So we can put that shadow in just with some diagonal hatching marks. So it's actually a lighter value, isn't it, than the rest of the face of the bridge. Shadows are normally a darker value, but this one is a lighter one. I'm not going to put anything on there. I'm going to leave that as it is. I can get this shadow line in here. Just carry it on through. Nice strong mark there, just to show that there's a bit of a ledge there. And I want to just break up the purely vertical lines of these central pillars. And it's going to allow me to add a little bit of texture, certainly on these bottom ones as well. But rather than using perfectly perpendicular hatches as we have there, we want to keep this as separate textures to this plane. So I'm just going to use some diagonal ones. So just on the outer edge, not all the way across, but just the outer edge. Don't have to be all the way through. This is the 0.1 pen. I'm going to give you the most control. Allows me to strengthen any real strong shadow areas, which this one is here. Just around the bottom there. So wherever one structure meets another, you can spend a little bit more time around where those two structures meet, because that would be what you would actually see in real life, where dirt and grime and whatnot is collecting. The next area I'm going to focus on is the underneath of the bridge. Now this is in the foreground, but it is moving away from our focal point. So I want to be less deliberate with the mark making, a little bit more sketchy, and that means I can move to a bigger pen. So I've got the 0.5 pen, and I'm going to go in first of all just to establish this line again, and I want to go quite strong here. So again, taking these hatching marks in the direction that it would move. So not all parallel lines, they're going to gradually diverge until it meets this line here, so this outer line here of the bridge. So again, just be careful of that you don't simply run your lines all at one angle. And that needs strengthening. I think that would benefit from a nice real strong dark, particularly on this side. Let's put the darks in that are underneath this structure, whatever this is here. So there's a real dark shadow shape that you can see underneath that. Anytime you see really dark shadows, that's a great opportunity to add some real punch and strength to your drawing. So don't be conservative. There are places within any ink drawing where you're going to completely obliterate the white paper underneath, and used conservatively, you know, not too many places, it really will add that depth and that punch to your drawing. So this structure underneath here is really, really strong. There is, the light is just hitting, there's an area of light there. So I'm going to make marks that are along the lines of this. Looks like a metal plate, maybe some extra support. So just building it up, it's going to be almost jet black, this shape, but avoid the temptation of just filling it in or colouring it in almost, and keep your lines moving in one direction. Okay, and then I want to put some hatching marks just to bring the value of this up. So I can go back to the big pen again, 0.5, but again keep those hatching marks going towards your vanishing point. So they're going to be relatively flat here, and then as we move out, they're going to move more in line with this construction mark here. So again, from this left edge and out. The angle's now slightly changing as I come across, not that much. So don't worry if you put a few incorrectly down. As long as you catch it early, the subsequent marks that you put on will save you from those. So next step then, let's deal with this side of the bridge here. Now this is really busy and intricate, isn't it? And the last thing that I want to be doing is drawing in every strut, every pillar, every post. But what I do want to do is avoid making it look too uniform and too sloppy. So the way that I'm going to approach this, we'll look at the top row first. The most important thing is that sense of perspective. And obviously things from a foreshortening point of view get closer together, they get shorter as they get further into the distance. So each of these sort of squares with a cross in is going to get smaller as it gets further away, and each vertical pillar is going to get closer together. So that first thing that I'm going to put in then is the vertical pillars. So 0.1 pen, because it is a small intricate area, and lines that are quite close together to begin with, and then just gradually, obviously not counting these, but gradually I'm just ever so slightly increasing the distance between them until when I get to the foreground past the bridge, it's actually quite a large shape. Now because these are railings and they're largely see-through, what I'm going to do is just take some value just down from the bridge, but not quite as dark. So down from here, down from this one as well. And that's just going to add to this idea that there is, you know, some transparency there in between the gaps. Now for these smaller ones further away, I'm just going to put these in as a cross. So just touching very lightly, just across in the centre of the square. Slightly stronger where it's over, you know, something that's behind it. So obviously the bridge that's behind it. And then as we get to these couple of forward ones here, and then as we get to these nearest ones, these closest ones, I'm just going to take the time just to draw a more solid shape in. So, you know, more like the ironwork would be. So just a series of triangles and negative shapes in the negative drawing. And what this does is it sets in the viewer's mind, or gives them an idea of what they are, so that when they then look at what just look like crosses further down, they interpret them as being a little bit more than just a cross in a box. Okay, now we do want to put some shadow underneath each of these particular pillars. There's a rail with some shadow underneath, but I'm not just going to do a solid line. Under each one, 0.1 pen. Going to try and do separate marks, just again to give an indication that these are separate sections within this one rail. And then we can do a little bit of shadow work on the vertical, on each vertical, but just on the right hand vertical. It's the side obviously that would be in shadow. So spending a bit more time just on, again, on these first few, just because that sets a precedent of for the remaining ones. And we've got a shadow underneath. Again, I'm just going to break the shadow line up. I can do larger marks as I get closer, longer lines. Again, all helps that sense of perspective, the sense of foreshortening, I should say. On this bottom row, strengthen this line slightly, just make it a little bit more accurate. So again, let's separate the sections closer together and then gradually get them further apart. Now for these ones here, this red fencing here, I do want to do a little bit of negative drawing. So each vertical is white, isn't it? So I've put them in dark at the moment. But if I just do some hatching to the left-hand side of each one, and then leave a gap between the next one, hopefully what that will do is put them in negatively, so reserving the white space, and you're then left with the pillar. And it just helps to break things up from always putting in those positive marks, those dark positive marks. And then just above each one, to get that shadow in again. And then a shadow down the left-hand side, sorry, the right-hand side of each pillar. And as you get to the, towards the end there, it really just becomes you're just hitting miss marks. Now I don't know if you can see, there's a little shadow area here, which is a nice little feature, and it just helps to separate this area up. So all I'm going to do is just hatch in marks straight across everything that I've put in there. There we go, and it's as simple as that. Now for the rest of the drawing, I'm going to stick to the 0.1 pen. Everything's getting into the distance now. We want to keep our marks nice and fine, nice and refined. So for this part of the bridge, just following the curvature of the lines that you've already put in, there is some kind of gantry structure underneath there. I think that's going to be a nice way to break this long shape up underneath. So I'm going to leave that in. So I'm just leaving a little bit of white space. You can see I put some lines, some perspective lines in initially, just so I know where to leave them. And then we've got this area of the bridge, which is darker than this area. So this looks like some kind of a support again. I think that is useful to separate those two pieces, because again, it's just going to help to break up this overall shape. So we'll just add more hatching marks to this part of the bridge. It's going to get darker as we get in closer. So just being careful not to break into this upright of this bridge here, because we want to keep that a nice light value. Okay, over this area, just a little bit lighter, because it's not completely white. It's there's some pipe work, and just deal with this by just putting in some darker shadow areas that you can see. You can see some sort of gantry, crisscross gantry, so put some shadow areas in there. It's just an impression, so don't get too hung up on the actual shapes of this. Okay, if you want to put a little bit of cross hatching on, you can do. I think that's a good idea, just to keep it the continuity going across the rest of the bridge. Again, where's our vanishing point? Make sure our hatching marks go towards that. So using the side of the pen here, so I've got more control. I'm not worried if I don't get any ink coming at first. I can just adjust the angle of the pen then slightly. It gives me lots of control then. And then our old crisscross shapes again, just put in a few on this side, really close together now, because they're really going into the distance, until you get to a point where you're basically just adding some marks just to break up the white of the shape. And then the same structure on this end of the Brooklyn Bridge, we can be really quite quick with. So I'm going to keep the mark making similar. So I want vertical marks. And then you're just going to add in any major shadow blocks that you can see that just give a sense of these pillars that are there. Shadow areas underneath where the bridge meets. Don't want to do any cross hatching on this. Don't want that level of intricacy on the bridge that is this far away. And now let's look at the city in the background, the buildings, the skyline. So we want to keep this relatively nondescript. All I would say is you're looking for the major shadow shapes and the light within each of the buildings. And that's all you really want to render. You can add, you know, the odd impression of a window here and there, but it's got to be really kept to a minimum. So I'm going to look for any of the major shadow sides of the building. So this one here is quite obvious. So let's get that one in. I want to keep the marks all in the same direction. So no cross hatching now, just hatching marks. That way it keeps everything a little bit cleaner and a little less distracting to the eye. So we've got this building here, which is quite a strong shadow. And I'm not taking it all the way to the bottom because there's obviously bits and bobs going on along the shoreline that we can't really make out. I'll always tend to get sort of a dark value just along the shoreline. So that can help to put that in as well. It gives you something to work to at the bottom. That's a little bit strong. So if you just use your finger, just while the ink is still wet, just press on and dab off. It will take a little bit of that value away for you. So really using the pen on the side. See the side of the angle there? And that is helping to minimize the flow of ink. Gives me more control, keeps the values nice and light. Looks like there's some trees there or maybe shadow. It's quite hard to distinguish, but it's a dark area nonetheless. So we get that in. So really just very simple hatching marks quite far apart. That helps to, again, tell the viewer that it's a lighter value. And if you want to put the odd impression of a window in, you can do, but I would keep it to a minimum, only just on the buildings where it's really obvious, this group here, I would say. Okay, so the only thing left for us to do then is the cabling and an impression of some water. So let's do the cabling first. Now this is the kind of thing that isn't difficult, but if you're not careful, it can mess things up a little bit. So before you just dive in and start adding cables anywhere and everywhere, just have a look for the major ones first and just look at the shape of them. So this one here obviously curves around, but just have a look where the curve is. So it's somewhere around this intersection between the two parts of the bridge. So if you're not confident, maybe draw in with pencil first. But I'm just going to put mine in straight with pen. So I'm going to curve around there and I'm going to ghost the line and it's going to meet somewhere up here. So ghost that line somewhere around there. And then when you're happy that that's in, strengthen that line. It's quite a strong line because of the shadow underneath it. It's a nice sunny day this, so lots of shadows going on. Okay, that's all I'm going to put in. I am going to put in just a few of these little I don't know what they are, but sort of maybe collars around the actual beam itself. And what that'll do, hopefully, is just give the impression that it's actually quite a thick, solid shape. So getting closer together as you get further apart. There we go. And then these two here now, these should be easier to put in. But again, just look at the angles where they intersect things. So we've got one here. And that looks like it carries on through, so ghosting your pen across, carrying that on through. This one's slightly more, it's a convergent angle, mine's not, but never mind. Nobody's going to notice. We've got one that's through here. Okay, and then we've got these vertical lines that are very faint. So what I'm going to do is side of the pen. I'm not expecting to get out any ink initially, but that's okay. I can build that up. So side of the pen, I want really, really faint lines now, so real hit and miss lines. There we go, something along that line. And when you find the right angle, it's easy then to hold the pen at that angle and just carry it along. A few more in here where will be extra around the other side. So let's get this major one in first. And this is where you may want to use the white Sakura pen. We'll come on to that in a moment so you can see what that's like. So angle, make sure you get that right. I don't want to mess things up with the perspective at this late stage. So it's intersecting around here, and then the angle is something akin to this one here. So it's going to be somewhere around here. Okay, and again, it's got these little notches on, obviously where the cables come off. We've got a couple of thin cables up there, so pen at an angle. Keep adjusting the angle till you find where the ink just starts to flow. And then we've got these thicker ones here as well, so intersecting here, roughly parallel to that first line, so put those in fairly confidently. There's another one there as well. Okay, and then I just want to put a sense of, not every cable obviously, but I just want to put a sense of some cables coming across here. So make sure that you go from the point, this insertion point here, where they're all inserting in, and not too strong a line initially, but just maybe have a look at one dominant one. So maybe this one here is coming across at this angle. And then again, from the insertion point, and then if you do have one to hand, very inexpensive, you know, just a couple of pounds, couple of dollars, white jelly roll pen. This is going to allow you just to add a little bit of extra detail, extra interest where this cabling is. Now these jelly roll pens, I find it does take a little bit of time just to get the ink flowing, so just off the paper to the side there, just start to get it flowing, just dabbing. And then I'm just going to follow the lines that I've put in already. So using this sparingly. And as you can see, you might think it's hardly worth putting in, you know, we're using it that little, but you can maybe add a few more if you want to, maybe some of the vertical ones as well. But the idea is not to go overboard with it. Okay, so all we've got left then is the water. Now I'm going to put this in really, really simply. I want to keep this to a minimum. It's just a very slight impression. So you can see there's some shadow area underneath here. So that's where we're going to focus our attention, and this area here too. So around this area, it's going to be very loose marks, just very sort of impressionistic wave marks almost. I'm actually using a 0.5 pen here, but I am trying to use it side on just so I can get a bit more control with those marks. And then as we get into the front here, I'm just going to put some bigger marks, just more indicative of waves. I know it's not wavy water, but I think this will work. So just a few random haphazard marks here and there, just underneath. Don't want to get them too uniform. Okay, I think that's enough. I think that should do it. Let's finish things off by putting in the American flag. There we go, just an impression, and then one in the distance again, just the merest hint of an impression. So there we go, Brooklyn Bridge in pen and ink.